All right, welcome everybody to an episode of Gospel Grit, the channel where we seek to apply the Word of God to the people of God for the glory of God. So, in this episode, one of the things that two objectives. Okay, the first one is going to be we're going to talk about the antediluvian world, which is the pre-flood world. Some characteristics about that, both with humanity as well as geology and structures, as well as megalithic or monolithic structures around the world, both pre and post flood, but mainly pre. This was another viewer submitted concept. So, gonna kind of read this just from an outline I've got. So we'll try to work our way through this as quickly as possible and try to get as much information packed in here as we can. So, the first thing we need to think about is the paradigm shift that we have as Christians from the way the world sees cataclysm, the way it sees the flood, the way it sees the way things come about in our lives. So let's define some terms, because obviously this is very hotly debated. And a lot of you guys know by this point that I'm a science teacher. That's what I spend most of my time doing, is teaching science. And so obviously we would be remiss to act like there is uniformity when it comes to how the world was formed, whether it be the Big Bang Theory or whether it be Darwinian evolution and that paradigm. What I really want to attack, and that's probably the right word, what I really want to attack today is the notion of steady state universe, if you want to use that term, and what you might call biblical cataclysm. So when I say steady state universe, we see it, I believe it's in Second Peter, we see that there's this argument that people have. It's the argument they used with the flood, and it's the argument they're going to use for the coming of Christ again too, by the way, that everything is the way it's always been and nothing really changes. Nothing really is contrasted or shifts. There is no cataclysm. There is no paradigm changing or shifting event. We don't have these big moments that change everything in a very short period of time, what we might call a cataclysmic view of the world. Whereas the Word of God makes very, very clear from Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 that that is exactly what happened. God made the world in 6 literal days, rested on the 7th literal day, and then he went about working his will out through men, angels. We know we've talked extensively about Genesis on and on and on over the past few episodes with the Nephilim and whatnot. But by the time we get to the flood, my argument in this episode is that the flood is actually much more radical than we think it is. The flood is not just a moment where humanity was drowned. It's not just a moment where things don't go right and God has to hit the reset button, although that's true. And the Nephilim videos would be great to reference back to if you haven't watched those to understand what I'm talking about. But we come across these terms, especially in the research, which I've had to do a lot of for this episode and others, of the antediluvian, not anti, but antediluvian world and the post-flood world. So let's define what the world looked like and how we should understand it before the flood. So my argument in this episode is that cataclysm has been a huge part of the biblical narrative. It's a huge part of human history, and it is the only theory that it all is true and explains the set of facts that we come into contact with concerning things like biology or geology or the world around us. So antediluvian is just a fancy word meaning pre-flood, before the flood. And my argument is that most of the world we experience today, is nothing like at all the world of Noah's day. So conservative time frames and estimates would be that the world, the not particularly the cosmos, although that would be the case too, but the world, planet Earth, is roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years old, right? So contrasted with Darwinian evolution and the Big Bang model, and you may want to Google those. For now, let me just suffice it to say that the Big Bang model is that somewhere between 14 and 18 or so billion years ago, in a point of infinite density, a singularity brought forth all of time and space, and everything that you are and I am and the world around us is, all of physics and chemistry, and then eventually biology. All of that arose from a random quantum fluctuation, and I'm trying to be as fair as possible. And because of that, everything is random and by chance. Many would argue who hold this view that that doesn't mean that life is meaningless. I argued in the last video about atheism that that just doesn't fly. It doesn't check out. So the antediluvian world is the world before the flood. And if we have the biblical view, the 6-day creation view, which in my opinion is the only way to view it, and by the way, lay my cards on the table, it's also young earth creation. I don't believe the world is billions of years old. I don't believe the text supports that. I don't think it's very old at all. There are tons of things that have the appearance of age that are not old whatsoever. For example, Adam was made perfect, right? He was made morally pure, clean. He was created as we assume, a grown adult, right? So he's not created as a baby, right? He doesn't have to be weaned off of breast milk. He's not eating semi-solids and then working his way up to solids. He's created as a man. He's created from the dust of the ground. God blows the breath of life into his nostrils and then creates Eve from his rib. And she and he are both fully formed at the point of their creation, meaning that even though they were 10 seconds old, they look to be probably in their late teens, early 20s. Who knows? Who knows at all? I don't want to speculate about that. We don't know that from the text. What we do know is that he had the appearance of age, even though he was not old. There's absolutely no reason in a miraculous creation like what we see in Genesis to assume that just because things don't look young, that they can't be young. We know the opposite is also true in science. We see a condition like progeria, where that horrific disease affects typically young people, very young kids, and they have a degenerative body-wide, system-wide condition that causes them to not be able to repair their cells, and aging builds up over and over and over in their cells, and their telomeres start to break down at a rapid rate, meaning that the genetic degeneracy ramps up by decades, and so they may be 10 years old and look like they're 80 years old, and they have the heart and the kidneys and the lungs and the stomach and the liver and everything else of an 80-year-old, and they don't make it out of their teens. That's not because they're old, it's because of aging. So it's important to understand in our paradigm here, and I think it's very difficult for people to grasp, but it is true. First of all, things don't have to be old to look old. They can have the appearance of age, especially in a supernatural creation. It happened with Adam. The reverse happens with progeria, and there are plenty of other examples. God made plants. He made animals. We assume that when he made them, they didn't start out as babies or zygotes or embryos or fertilized eggs. That process started from the beginning with whole creatures to kick off the reproductive cycle and however they reproduce. There's that. There's also the concept that if God makes a world in 6 days, the whole cosmos and the whole created order is 6 days old at the maximum, and yet it's doing everything it's supposed to do. That includes stars that are supposed to be 10 billion years old. The paradigm of Darwinian evolution and the Big Bang just doesn't cut it, and it certainly does not gel with the Bible and the biblical narrative. And I want to be clear about that. I don't want to talk forever about this episode, but please understand that Darwinism and the Big Bang Theory, whether it be through hybrid sort of views, and I'm trying to be as charitable as possible, like the gap theory or the day age creation or epochs or time frames or theistic evolution, those things don't at all jive with the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative in the Hebrew and in the English, honestly, is very clear. Darwinism must be rejected. The day age theory, the gap theory, theistic evolution, all of those must be rejected, not just on grounds of the textual analysis, but also on grounds of the inevitable sort of cost. And I say that a lot on this channel, that what you believe will have a price tag, and having views like that will cost you a lot. They come with small print that you often don't read, but it costs great amounts of intellectual, moral, and spiritual capital that you're not willing, nor should you be willing to pay. Be clear about that. So Noah's Ark would have been roughly, and there's debate about this, but under the young earth creation model, Noah's Ark would have been about 5,500 years ago, roughly, give or take, meaning that Noah emerged from the flood after the 40 days to what would begin to be written language, right? So written language was not necessarily a thing up to that point. At least we don't have great records of that. We started to see that in Sumer and Akkadian and places like that, and pretty soon with the Hebrews. It's also, as a passing comment, I also ought to make when we talk about creation, we talk about Noah's flood, that the flood narrative for many, if not all, except the biblical account, the flood legend, the flood myth, is almost universal. It's prolific in almost every ancient culture, whether it be, again, the Akkadians, whether it be the Sumerians, whether it be, the Philistines, the people who, some of the first boat makers. And again, remember, we have to have a biblical framework on how we think of this, because we've been so inundated with so many non-biblical things that have made their way into our minds, into pop cultural thinking, as well as one of the things that needs to be said out loud is that just because we claim we have evidence, there is a world of difference between, for example, half of a skull of a human ancestor and what that proves. And there is a lot of logical jumping that goes on. There's a whole lot of hand waving and a lot of sort of deception that we must fight against when it comes to this, because we are told a narrative with scant at best evidence. And the evidence, in my opinion, actually points to the opposite. If we're going to do science, then we must think God's thoughts after him. That's what Isaac Newton said. A couple of things in my research that I came up with, trying to pack as much information here as I can. Adam, of course, I said, was made morally and spiritually and physically perfect. He lived to be 930 years old. We don't know. It's just pure speculation how long he lived before the fall and before the curse that was pronounced on him and the ground and Eve and the serpent. But there's estimates of he was a few hours old to he was a few decades old. We don't really know. We know that, and this is something you should remember when it comes to the flood narrative, that he had abilities that are absolutely lost to us, right? So he had dominion over animals. He ruled them. He not only did he name them, God brought the animals to him. He named them, but he also had dominion over them. God told him that he was to rule over them. Now, as a perfectly adapted physical specimen before the fall, he absolutely would have been able to do that. Now, I'm not saying he's Dr. Doolittle, but I am saying that he had the capacity and the ability to do things that would be absolutely unbelievable and inexplicable to us in our excuse me, day and time. So some of the Hebrew legends say that Adam was made 15 feet tall. And that he, and again, I know you're probably thinking Nephilim after watching this channel, but that's not at all what we're saying. That's not the intended point, but that God would have made him potentially a lot bigger than modern man. And part of that, and this is what we need to get into next, is the oxygen levels would have dropped. So really our atmosphere is only about 20% oxygen at this point. And I'm spitballing here sort of off the top of my head. So oxygen is about 20%. Roughly 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, and the other, 8% or so is argon. If we had an atmosphere that was much more oxygen, it would become flammable at some point if it was a lot more. But there's good evidence that indicates that indeed the antediluvian world was full of oxygen, meaning that even though oxygen now, as part of the curse, is certainly degrading the tissues and causing the aging process in human beings as well as animals, that wasn't the case to begin with. So if there's more oxygen, then there's more oxygenation for the cells. If there's more oxygenation for the cells, then animals get larger and larger and larger, including human beings. So Adam very likely could have been much bigger, much more physically capable, much more intimidating and imposing of a physical specimen without being at all connected to the Nephilim. Obviously, that came later on, so that makes no sense. What that would have meant is that physical and mental degeneration would not have really been a part of his world before the fall, and therefore the idea of, mental illness and all of the physical incapacitations we have, whether they be physical ailments or, psychosomatic issues. I mean, on and on it goes. We can all trace those to sin, and we can ultimately trace those as well. Most of them to the curse, right? So that degeneration would have come from sin. Adam, it stands to reason, should be and would be considered a super intellect, right? And that's very important because the pre-flood world, his offspring, for potentially, and to be clear, potentially hundreds and hundreds of years before the flood, which is when I'm arguing these superstructures were made, Adam would have had the ability, along with his offspring, to build things that seem absolutely impossible, not only at the time because of modern man and all of the technology we have that was not accessible to the world in the time of Adam, but also that we just simply can't do now, that we can't replicate, right? Some of those structures that you've heard of and maybe some you haven't. Some of the pre-flood conditions that need to be talked about here is that, and you guys may have heard this, and I hope this sparks your interest because this is certainly not exhaustive, trying to keep it fairly short, but go look it up on your own. So the pre-flood canopy that Genesis references or appears to reference, that there was a canopy or a giant, water canopy or tarp in the atmosphere that held water, and it had never rained before. It stands to reason from Genesis 6 and 7 that it had never rained before. Instead, it says a mist came up from the ground and watered the plants and gave the animals water. So that's very interesting. That would be a huge difference. We see rain all the time here in East Texas. It rains constantly for no reason and for not very long. No seasons. There appears to be a reference in Genesis 6 and 7 about how it doesn't look like there were any seasons. So now we know the Earth has a 23.5 degree tilt on its axis. That's very observable. We know we have a north and a south pole that was not at all present probably before the flood. My argument would be all of the metallic stuff from the core and the mantle working its way because of the flood, working its way to the north and south pole, caused what we now think of as the poles and compasses and all of those things. But the cataclysm, again, here's that word again, the cataclysm of the flood caused maybe a tilting of the earth because of the shifting of the axes, and at 23.5 degrees, meaning that not only, do we have seasons, right? And here we don't have all 4 seasons, but we certainly do in other places on the globe, that those didn't exist. And so we lived in a tropical environment where there was plenty of water. Sin had not fully and finally made its physical presence known in every way, shape, and form that we know of now. That had not been present. And so because of that, animals and plants could grow huge because of oxygen, plentiful water, as well as tropical conditions year round and globally. Pangea. Right? I'm going to try to hopefully bring this plane to land here in a second, but Pangea, you guys have heard of this. It means all earth. You probably were taught this in science class. I know I teach it to my kids. Here's the thing though. Pangea was supposedly, 250 million years ago. I've already said that makes no sense with the biblical narrative. Any other narrative that conflicts with the biblical narrative doesn't matter, because whatever the Bible says is our final and sole source of authority. So if science conflicts with that, then we scrap that scientific theory. That's just simply how it goes. So basically, Pangea is the idea that, according to science, 250 years ago, there were a bunch of continents that had joined together into a supercontinent. And there's evidence that that lasted for a short period of time from the biblical perspective, which would explain why the puzzle pieces appearance of all the different continents. So, for example, South America and Africa appear on their coasts, that they at one point were joined together into a perfect puzzle piece appearance. And I believe that's true. I believe that's very likely. The world of Noah, even before Pangea, would have probably been a supercontinent. From everything I've read and researched, it probably would have been a supercontinent, right? And a supercontinent that allowed for travel all across the world. So the seas were not divided. The Bible makes that very clear. And therefore, the lands probably were not divided. That's also why we have T-Rex skeletons, in North America and Africa and all over the globe. We see a universal burying of cataclysmic proportions in the fossil record, all in the strata of the rocks. And that demonstrates that not only was there continental shifting probably at the flood, but also that it happened in a very, very short period of time. Again, cataclysm is what we're talking about. Genesis makes very clear that there was a layer of water. Now, this is something to research if you're interested. There was a layer of water underneath the crust of the earth. So when it says the fountains of the deep broke forth and sprang forth, the idea is that at some point there was no rain, right? So I said the mist comes up from the earth, but when the flood started, that canopy probably broke. That's what it seems to indicate from the text, but also that the springs of the deep, not the ocean itself, but geysers, if you want to think of it that way, underneath in the crust of the earth, bursting forth this layer of water. And only within the past few years have we actually discovered that there is a water table. There is a huge amount of water, it seems geologists have found, underneath the crust of the earth, underneath the ocean. So we have water in the sky, in the firmament. We have water, what you would think of in the atmosphere, but we also have water all on our planet, 70% or so covered in water with oceans and lakes and streams, but also water below the crust of the earth in what we previously thought was just hot mantle. So the Bible, as always, was right thousands of years before we were. Now, when we talk about the structures that would have been built at this time, I wanted to connect those because I think it's important for us to sort of get a grip and understand what that means. So when we start to connect our structures, here's a couple of things that you might find interesting. And there's so many, many, many examples of this. But my argument is that modern man was able to do things with his abilities, both mentally, physically, and spiritually before the flood and after the fall, of course, and maybe even with Adam, before the fall, but certainly after the fall, before the flood, that have survived to this day. And I wrote a few of these down. So pardon me as I read these, but I think they're worth saying. So what we have is we have these different giant structures. What we call them is megalithic sites. So you're familiar with some of these. They'll become pretty clear to you, I think. We have to ask the question, where did they come from? At what point were they made? How do we understand them in the context of human history? Because we're told with Darwinian evolution over and over and over, it's pounded in our head in public school from the time that we're little kids, that ultimately man has constantly progressed, that progress is our lot, and that we have gotten better, and every organism has gotten better, and the ones that don't get better over time, they are punished by being eradicated, because natural selection means the strongest survive and the weakest are weeded out. And it just appears from the text of the Bible that the absolute opposite is the case. Remember, aging does not come from time. And I know that's probably a scandalous claim. Aging doesn't come from time. I use the example of progeria. I use the example of Adam. Just because time goes along doesn't mean someone has to age. We all know people who are 45 and look 65, and we all know people who are 65 and look 45. It's very clear that degeneration has been caused by the curse, and is caused by the fall and by sin. So it stands to reason that not only is evolution wrong in its outworkings and the way we interpret it, but it's absolutely counterintuitive to what we see with the evidence. Evolution doesn't make any sense logically, considering things like these structures, things like the astronomy, the physics, the mathematics, the astrological signs that the ancients knew, their ability to live for hundreds and hundreds of years, their ability to do things and think things and understand things that we absolutely have no clue about now. Lost knowledge. In so many ways, we have regressed, not progressed. So there are various sources about these megalithic structures, and there are competing theories. Everything from chemically induced materials that were used in their structures, think pyramids of Giza, that's the most famous one, to soften and reform stones, and ramps and pulleys and levers and all of those things to transport stuff up and down, to the idea of giants. Here we go again, moving these unmovable structures. And lastly, of course, and this is similar to the Nephilim theory, is the half demon and half man who have super strength like the giants to be able to move things that now to us are utterly incomprehensible. So I'll give a couple of examples, and hopefully I can throw pictures up here, and we'll bring this thing to a close. I know it's a little longer. Let's examine some structures of the ancient world, probably, in my opinion, created by angel technology and the aid of giants. But this would have been antediluvian, before the flood, Noah's world, where everything basically was better and stronger and bigger and more intact than it is now. A world radically different, one that we can't even possibly imagine, the one that we live in. So, a couple of sites. Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is in modern Turkey, and it was created before pottery was even used. There are some indications, although I don't necessarily believe it, but it bears saying here. There are some indications that Göbekli Tepe is 11,000 years old at its oldest site, which would mean it's the oldest or second oldest site on the planet. Interestingly enough, Jericho, yes, the biblical city of Jericho with the walls falling down, is one of the oldest sites in the world. But Göbekli Tepe was believed to be created before pottery and written language. It has pillars that are up to 18 feet tall and 32,000 pounds apiece. Now think about that. So 16 tons, 32,000 pounds apiece. And like I said, hopefully I've got a picture up here upon editing to show you guys so you can picture this. And there's no evidence at all, this is important, that there were beasts of burden, oxes, things like that, used at all in the creation of Göbekli Tepe. And it was moved 1,000 feet by humans or some other non-described being moving these things, right? That's unbelievable. This would have been before the flood. We still can't replicate this stuff with our own technology. Obviously, a very, very famous example would be the Great Wall of China, believed to be built much more recently, but about 2,500 years ago. But think about these specifications here. It's so big, our minds can't really get around it. So it's believed to be about 13 million miles long, like in total, and all of it stretching out back and forth. Legends have it that the Great Wall of China was designed to keep out giant invaders. And you won't hear that in a textbook, but that it was to keep out giant invaders. On average, it's almost 26 feet high in most places. Now, you don't see that when you're maybe at the Great Wall of China, or you see a video of it, or you see a picture. You don't see that. You don't understand that. But 26 feet high, it's not just to keep out Genghis Khan, which is the average accepted theory. Again, we have paradigms, we have worldviews we operate from, ladies and gentlemen, and we have to protect those narratives, and we have to either cancel out information that doesn't jive with our narrative, or ignore that information altogether and re-explain it in a dishonest manner. You would really only need about 10 or 12 foot tall walls like we have at the southern border here in Texas to keep out invaders like Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and all of those. You don't need 26 foot tall walls. That's separate thing. One of the most remote islands in the world, you guys know this, it's Easter Island, and we have the Moai statues. There were originally, upon discovering, I believe it was in the 1800s, there were about 900 of them, ranging from everything from 10 feet tall to about 33 feet tall. Many of them, a lot of people don't know this, have full bodies. Some just have a head. Those are the ones that you are familiar with. Some of them are buried. Some of them are just standing. Most of them have been taken to museums, but they have some left still on the island. Some of the biggest ones, now think about this, weigh 82 tons. According to local tradition, they were moved with supernatural powers from miles away. They were quarried on this really hilly island, one of the most remote places on the earth, by some of these really ancient and supposedly not very advanced people at all. And you're telling me that some of these stones individually weigh, what is that, roughly 164,000 pounds apiece, and they were moved from miles away? Come on, man. That's not true. And if you disagree with me, leave a message, comment. I'd love to hear what you think, but how do you make sense of that? It's just not right, and we know it. If you really think hard, another famous site would be Baalbek. This is one that really, really fascinates me. So Baalbek is the name of the infamous god we read about in the Old Testament over and over and over again, that the Hebrews are worshiping instead of God. They're worshiping Baal. When Moses is up on the mountain getting the 10 commandments, they're worshiping him, right? Many believe that Baalbek is the oldest city on earth, again, about the age of Göbekli Tepe, maybe even older, about 11,000 years old. It's believed that it was built by Cain. That's one of the legends about Baalbek. So interesting. It's in modern day Lebanon, that it was built by Cain. And after he was banished for killing Abel, he migrated and built it in a fit of rage that God had cast him out and put a mark on him. And it also, weirdly enough, says that he forced a group of giants. Remember, this is Genesis 4. So he absolutely could have been involved in all kind of terrible, nasty, giant Nephilim involvement. And it's very likely that he was. I mean, we're not talking about a righteous person here. So he absolutely could have been trapped in that, and that many giants, he forced them into helping him build Baalbek. So again, that's legend. We don't know that for sure. It's not in the Bible. But interesting. So the biggest stones ever cut and quarried by human beings, supposedly human beings, is a stone in Baalbek. I believe it's called the Pregnant Woman Stone, and it's believed to be about 3.3 million pounds in weight. Again, largest stone ever cut and ever moved. Stonehenge. Last one we'll take here. Stonehenge is also helpful in this investigation. They say that Stonehenge, and I'm sure you've all seen a picture of that, but should have one here for you to look at. Each stone weighs about 50,000 pounds, right? So much smaller than the 3.3 million of Baalbek, but each stone weighs about 50,000 pounds. Most of them are about 13 feet high, and they were laid as early as 5,100 years ago. So most likely right after the post flood, within a few hundred years of Noah getting off the ark. So still potentially giants. We know that giants existed on the earth after. This is very important. I said this in Genesis 6, after the flood. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also after that. It's also believed that Merlin, the famous, we know him from Disney movies, but Merlin, the famous wizard, forced a giant, because of his magical powers, to build Stonehenge for him. So that's a quick rundown. I know I say almost 33 minutes, but it's a quick rundown of what the post, and more so importantly, the pre-flood, the antediluvian world was like, some of the characteristics, so many spin-offs, so many directions you could take with this. But I wanted to give that to you guys because a listener submitted that subject and how we should understand the pre-flood world. And my argument is that cataclysm is our way to understand the world before us, but that also means that we can't actually piece it together because it's so radically different from the way in the world that we know, right? And I keep referencing this in multiple episodes, but just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. So if you take that literally and you interpret that part of the Olivet Discourse as literal, then get ready, because at that time, Noah's flood wasn't just about flooding the world and ridding it of its wickedness, but it was about the turning of a chapter. It was about the world becoming new. It was about restarting not just humanity, but also the world. So the cataclysm involved there affected everything from geology to, astronomy to physics and to biology, certainly chemistry, all of those things, half-life, Pangea, plates, tectonic movement, the mantle, the poles, animal death, animal lifespans, adaptations. I mean, think of what you can learn in 930 years if you're Adam, and you spend some of those years perfect as a perfect human before the fall. So think of what you can learn and pass down in 930 years, 80 years if you're lucky here. So with that, I'll bring it to a close. Thank you guys for listening to all of the ramblings. I hope this benefited you. Drop me a comment, share it. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so, if it's valuable to you guys. We're almost at 1,000 views on the channel, and that's amazing. And thank you guys. That's your doing. So thank you guys for joining us on all of these crazy adventures, many more to come on Gospel Grit, which is always a channel where we seek to apply the word of God to the people of God for the glory of God. See you guys on the next one.